moderator for today's webinar session. The background of today's session is SISA has been a payment forensic investigator for over 8 years now, and we have been investigating a number of payment breaches across the world. Most of the time we have been asked, are there any lessons you have learned from these breaches? And after having got this feedback from different quarters of community, we put together a team to analyze our investigation report and see if we can share some trends and data points which may be useful to the community. So the first attempt of this was the SURF report of 2018, which we will cover in our today's session, followed with the lessons which we have learned from this data which we have. Quick housekeeping tips. Today's webinar is scheduled for an hour. It will be a 45 minutes of presentation and a 15 minutes of Q&A session. Please feel free to submit all your questions in the Zoom application. We will collect them and address it post the webinar. All attendees will be muted during the course of this webinar to enable the speakers to present without any interruptions. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit the questions in the Q&A option below your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on SISA's website for further references. Today, we have a panelist, DBS and Lohit, with us for this webinar. DBS is our CEO and has been one of our first PCI assessor. He's also a core payment forensic investigator and has only led many investigators over the last 8 years. He has been in the payment security space for the last 21 years, and we're very glad to have him in our webinar panelists today. Along with him, we have our colleague Lohit, who leads the Synergistic Security Operations Center's delivery unit, to add to DBS's thoughts and the lessons which we have learned. The core objective of this webinar today is to see if we can take back the key learnings from our forensic investigations and to see if we can improve the security posture at our respective organizations. Key topics which we will be covering in today's webinar are a brief introduction to SISA, SISA's forensic investigation, in which we will be covering the types of investigation we have conducted in 2018, the SURF 2018's statistics, followed with the key learnings and what did we find in our investigations. We will be covering up to 5 key learnings. Post the 45 minutes presentation, we will open up the dais for Q&A. Feel free to shoot as many questions you want, and our panelists will be glad to address them. So moving on to the global presence, here is an overview of SISA's global footprint and office locations that are catering to 40+ countries. In states, we have our offices in Irving, Texas, and in Sunnyvale, California. For UK, we have our offices in Welling, Kent, which is south of London. We are headquartered in India, Bangalore, and additional offices in Mumbai and Delhi. We cater to our Middle East customers from our Bahrain and Dubai office. Finally, for our Asia Pacific customers, we have our office in Philippines, Australia, and Singapore. We have many of our existing customers attending this webinar today who are aware of SISA, but for those who have joined us for the first time, here's a quick introduction about SISA. We are a payment security specialist and a cybersecurity expert since 2006, which is inception of PCI Council itself. Securing 2,000+ customers across the globe, SISA is one of the few PFI assessors registered with the PCI Council who has worked closely with all the payment brands and most of the central banks during our investigation. We are also a member of GARE, Global Executive Assessors Roundtable. GARE is a committee of top 20 assessors across the globe who are entitled to give feedbacks to PCI Council on our investigations, learnings, and findings. SISA has a unique combination of payment security expertise and deep forensic knowledge. The advantage of such combination is our PCI team works closely with the PFI team and understands the pattern of breaches and takes proactive measures during our PCI audits, thus assuring true security to all our customers. This also helps us in educating our customers to take proactive measures rather than reactive. We educate our customers via webinar, monthly newsletters, and of course SISA's LinkedIn page followers who are updated on weekly basis. Due to our rich expertise, SISA's PFI lab has been accredited with solving and containing some of the most sophisticated attacks in 2017 and 18. In 2017, we have conducted 24 such investigations, and in 2018, we have conducted 30 investigations. Now, to talk more about these 30 investigations we have conducted last year, I would like to call upon our CEO, DBS, to brief you on the same. Over to you, DBS.
Thanks, Adi. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. We are very glad to have you for this webinar at this point in time. Our core objective of today's webinar, as Adi mentioned, is to see how we can all work together to improve the security posture by learning from the breaches that we have investigated. One of the key intention is not, of course, to get to the specific, but to see if there are any learnings that we can take back home. First, we will have a look at some of the quick data facts that we have pulled out from our investigation. Then we will have a sneak preview of some of the compromises that we are seeing. And lastly, we will look at the 5 key learnings that we've been able to summarize based on the investigations that we have done. Later on, my colleague Lohit will expand on one of the key findings that we have observed over the years and what we are doing at SISA to address that. Before we get started, one of the things that I would like to gauge at this point in time, since we have got a very diverse audience, is to see what industry vertical is represented in today's call. So if you can take a minute or take a few seconds actually and probably help us understand from which industry you belong to, so that we can actually contextualize this webinar to the industry that we have our representation in today's webinar. So as we collect the poll from all of you, one of the key intentions to reiterate is to see if we can actually go ahead and take these learnings and improve the security posture. So feel free to type in your questions as we speak today in the webinar. As Adi mentioned, we will probably we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to address any questions that you may have with regarding to whatever we've spoken. So feel free to type in your questions. So we've got the poll out here. We've got representation from banking, consulting, healthcare, processes. We've got about 20%, retail 20%. So pretty much a diverse crowd. It's good to see representation from across, and we'll try to make sure that we address different industry verticals in today's session. Moving on, we will get to the breaches. This is the slide which I would like to spend a little time. As Adi rightly mentioned, we've been asked by a number of our customers and organizations worldwide to see if we can actually share some of our results of our investigations, so that we could actually take it back and see how we can use that information for protecting our own environments or organizations. So we put together a small team which could collect this data and create some metadata for us to use it and give it back. And then this is what this is one of the extracts from our investigation or the SURF 2018 report. So here you would see 6 broad sections. For those of you who are familiar with the PCI DSS standard, would equate this to the PCI DSS standard, the 6 sections which is spread across 12 requirements. The first being the network, the network, and then of course data security, vulnerability management, access controls, development, and monitoring. So what does this slide essentially mean? So one of the key things when we actually do investigations is to identify how many of the organizations were not adhering to payment security best practices, which may have contributed to the breach. So this essentially, if you were to take the first section, the network, which and interpret this slide, which essentially means that compared to say a PCI DSS standard covering requirement 1 and requirement 2, for example, one would identify that 38% of the organizations were meeting those requirements in its true form, and 62% were not adhering to those requirements when we actually conducted the investigation. So that kind of reflects as to how many organizations were following the best security practices when we actually did the investigation. Then for the data security, essentially covers data at rest and data in transit. What was the security controls in place? We found that 33% of the organizations were compliant, and a big 67% were not compliant. One could also understand that since data security requirements essentially cover with respect to encryption and so on and so forth, that's one of the widely used requirement for compensating controls. So that's one of the reasons why you would see a large amount of organizations may have not complied or followed the best security practices. And obviously, data security covers not just encryption, but also talks about the fact that if you were to do any of those practices, you need to follow appropriate key management processes and so on and so forth. Vulnerability management is the ability of the organization to identify, analyze, and mitigate these vulnerabilities from the time they are published. The typical window prescribed in the PCI DSS standard is about 90 days. Access controls talks about the fact that organizations need to have a proper need-to-know process, need to have a proper authentication. And then when it comes to development, we've seen organizations, once again, when we did the investigations, had not followed, not just during the development process, but even during the design as well as deployment. So many of these applications were vulnerable. Down in some of the slides down, we would also talk about how organizations have been able to get compromised because of these vulnerable applications used as a source of entry into the organizational network before they were, before they could actually do lateral movement and egress the data. Last but not the least is the monitoring requirement. This is something that we've been is pretty much a big eye opener for us, and it's been one of the teething issues for a very long time that we've seen organizations really not able to identify compromises, detect them. As we've heard this a number of times, that there are only two types of organizations. One is being breached, and the other organization is who does not know they're being compromised. So when it comes to monitoring, we've seen organizations really lacking in terms of the ability to detect and also proactively go and search for any kind of malicious traffic within their particular organizational network, and which we will later explain when we come to the concepts of monitoring and threat hunting. With respect to monitoring, again, one of the things that stands out in our observations has been that some of the investigations which we did, the logs were not even present during the compromise period. And one of the typical answers we got at that point in time is that the logs were really not there for the compromise period, because it was, the logs essentially had overwhelmed the server, and essentially the data had got lost. So which made our forensic investigation a lot more challenging. So we've got varying kind of instances of how monitoring has not been up to the mark as to with respect to protecting an organization. Some of the other data points that our SURF report threw up is that over the average window of vulnerability, which when we analyzed from the time that the vulnerability was actually identified and the vulnerability was fixed, is about 300 days, which is a big number, which is kind of matches with the industry data as well. The other statistic that we've got is the dwell time, which is the time which we call as the time a system is compromised and it is detected that it's being compromised, was around 6 to 9 months, which is way higher than what the industry average essentially is about 90 days. So that's something that we found out quite strange in our investigation when we did that. The dwell time happened to be about 6 to 9 months, in the sense that organizations, the dwell time looks to be a lot higher than, especially in the payment data investigations, than what is typically found in other kinds of investigations or other kind of breaches. So that's some data points for you from the breaches. Quick idea of how the breaches play out in 2018 from our SURF report. Moving on, one of the typical other questions that we always get is how are organizations faring with respect to PCI DSS, or rather, how many of these organizations were adherent to the PCI DSS standard at the time of investigation. So when we did the investigation, how many of them were PCI DSS certified, how many of them were not? So this is one question that we usually get, and we thought that we'll address that. So in this slide, you would see organizations, when you say compliant, they essentially mean that they're certified, either self-certified or self-attested, maybe an SAQ, or a level 1 compliance, which has been assessed out by either internally or by an external assessor on a level 1 compliance. And then when you say non-compliant, it means they're not certified for PCI DSS compliance. And then you would see typically a spread between merchant, banks, and service providers. And I see that there is a good distribution between service providers, banks, and merchants when we did the poll. So this might be useful data for you, which is we see almost about 79% of service providers who were compliant on the date of compromise, or when we actually did the investigation, but they were still compromised, which essentially means that effective implementation of the PCI DSS requirements is important. Vis-a-vis about 21% who were not compliant at all when we did the investigation. When it comes to banks, it's about 90%, largely because banks are not required to actually demonstrate PCI DSS compliance, and hence have not gone through PCI DSS audits at any point in time. And then we've seen about 36% of the merchants who were not compliant when they were investigated. So this data with the earlier slide one thing that comes out very clearly is that effective implementation of the PCI DSS requirements is important. The earlier slide mentions about the fact that many of the organizations, when we did the investigations, were not meeting many of the PCI requirements in true spirit. And then you see organizations compliant but still getting compromised. So when you kind of match both the data points, then what comes out very clearly is the fact that organizations have to focus on effective implementation of the requirements and really not check the box. So moving on, the other question that we commonly get is how do organizations get, how do they get compromised? We have seen compromises that happen for PIN data. Especially if you're a service provider, we've seen compromises of the PIN, the CVV2. So one common question that we get is, were these systems so easy to get compromised? The answer is not really. The reason is that what we've seen is a typical pattern, taking clue from the Lockheed Martin's 7-step kill chain. We've kind of broken it up into 3 simple kill chain steps, which is one is of course the ingress, lateral movement, and then egress. So one of the key things that we've observed is that the crown jewels of the organizations that we investigated were never the direct target, or were never compromised from the very first point. They were actually the nth point of actually the intruder breaking into the network. In one case, we found 30 hops before they actually compromised the crown, in that case, the ATM switch. So that's something that kind of reflects the fact that today organizations have to have, compromise points can be any point at the perimeter device, or any device which any of the legitimate users are having or accessing. And then from there, you actually do lateral movement and then get to the crown jewel, or get to the what is coveted data device inside your organization, and then the intruder understands the environment, spends sufficient time to map all the network, and then at the right and the appropriate time does the exfiltration of data. So taking through from there, so three common ingress points which we have found in our investigation reports is one is of course publicly accessible web applications, which we spoke about earlier also from a development standpoint. The second is spear phishing, because that's one way to compromise super users or power users. And the third is we've seen cases where HRMS applications have been compromised, which is outside the high secure zone, and then used to compromise and do lateral movement, and then compromise something which is very, very crucial. We have also seen vulnerability management products or vulnerability management, since they have access to both high secure zones and low secure zones. They've been able to compromise both at different secure zones, because at the end of the day, the vulnerability management and patch management and antivirus products may have access to these kinds of systems across the network. So great. So moving on, one of the things that we've also questioned is how sophisticated are these kinds of attacks. Many of you may have read the UN Security Council's update that there are a lot of breaches that a couple of days back they had actually put out a note saying that North Korea, and there are a lot of compromises or initiation of attacks happening from North Korea, and some of the banks in Asia were targeted because of that. And were also they come out with data points around that. Now that's kind of sophisticated attack, but are all of them so sophisticated? The answer is no. So what we've seen is a mixture of something so simple as memory scraping attack on an EDC terminal that you see on the first section. That's something that because of a cashier wanting to take a screenshot of his application to send it to his corporate headquarters, downloads unauthorized software from the internet, which also carries malware, and then compromises that particular system to something as sophisticated as compromising a bank or an ATM switch, which would definitely take a lot of understanding of the network, understanding of the ATM switch platforms, understanding how the PIN authentication happens. The entire we've seen attacks like codebook attack, which is using the resources of the victim organization. A similar dictionary kind of attack on the PIN is done to crack the and compromise the particular issuing environment. So we kind of finding varying degrees of sophistication of attack. But one thing that comes out very natural is that it's not the common perception is banks have a lot of security budgets, hence they are able to spend a lot more money on security. While that is true, we've also found that it's quite attractive for the fraudster to go behind the bank as well. So that's something that comes out very clearly in our SURF report. That we've seen different degrees of sophistication of compromises that are happening across. For example, to explain what kind of one such indicators of compromise that we put out way back about 18 months ago, and still has been something that has been compromising issuing environments for a very long time, is the fake response malware. And this slide we just put in here so that you get an understanding of what kind of what's the kind of sophistication when it comes to the issuing environment or the banking environment, what kind of attacks we are seeing. Many of you may have heard that there are a series of banks which are being compromised, and ATM cash out frauds are happening, and many of them is being attributed to this fake response malware. And so how does it work? The fixed response malware, if you look at the first section of the slide, where you have the ATM, where a legitimate customer goes to an ATM and tries to withdraw cash, then the request essentially goes to the card scheme or through the acquiring bank, and then goes to the issuing bank, and then the ATM dispenses cash. Now that's how a legitimate transaction essentially happens. But in a fake response malware attack, what typically happens is the attacker compromises the issuing environment, puts a particular malware on the payment switch, and this malware waits for the malicious transaction to get initiated. And the moment it does, it looks up that particular card number, and then the moment it recognizes that card number, it actually sends out a success message without even having a validation done on the payment application switch. So the card scheme gets the success message, passes it on to the ATM, and the ATM dispenses cash. And typically, these ATM cash out frauds are done cross-border. That means outside the jurisdiction of the issuing bank. So then it becomes difficult for the law enforcement also to get a hold of those fraudsters. So this is typical fake response malware that attacks that we are seeing, and it's been quite prevalent. We ourselves have investigated over. We've completed investigation for about 3 banks, and we are actually investigating another 2 more banks on this particular fake response malware. And we see that across the world there have been a number of issuing environments. So far, we still don't see this in the service provider environment, but we believe that it would, is something that can be replicated in the issuing service provider environment as well. And it's something that we should all be looking out for. Moving on, the learnings, before I hand it over to Lohit, I want to spend a little more on the next slide, which is what is the core objective of today's session. While great, we've gone through all these investigations. What were the 5 key learnings that I would want to share in this webinar, and share from our SURF report as well? These are the 5 key learnings, and these are some of the things that we've been observing, not in 2018 alone. Some of them have come in 2018, but say, for example, the Security Operations Center is something that we've been observing for the last 8 years since we've been doing investigation. That in 2017 we counted as 24 and 0, 24 organizations where we did investigations, and out of them, all 24 were actually reported by third parties, not internally at all. And so organizations essentially got a weekly call when they were, when there were incidents reported out there in the media, or end customers started reporting, or the card schemes essentially said that you may have been compromised, and that's why you need to do a forensic investigation. So that's something that really is something that we need to focus on. I'm sure Lohit will speak a little bit more about it. Second is with respect to data discovery. Inadvertent data storage is one of the common problems, and there's always this clever IT admin who would have taken a backup of the data just in case something goes wrong. There's always this clever developer who would have made sure that there is a copy of the production data, so that when system goes, so that he can actually make sure that the test cases are written properly. So data discovery is one big problem, and that's one key learning, that we need to do effective data discovery in order to protect our environments. The third is incident response and forensics. We've seen many organizations struggling to respond when there is a compromise that essentially, or suspected compromise that has been reported. Most organizations squander when actually it's time to respond, and we all know that the time to contain a compromise is directly proportionate to the reputation or financial loss that an organization incurs or suffers. So it's quite natural that organizations should focus on incident response and forensics. The process should have have that covered with respect to how to take a chain of custody of the image. How do you essentially have that analyzed, and how do you respond we've seen organizations right from the time that some organizations pull the plug, but those kinds of breaches are out of the past now, because you have many of them are compromises that are done in the volatile memory. So by doing that, you're essentially one would essentially destroy the ability to recover and identify what really went wrong. So we're making it all more challenging for forensics team. Then we've got the vulnerability management. We all saw the Equifax kind of a compromise, which wherein we the vulnerability was revealed or was published in the first week of March, and then the exploit the patch was released in a couple of days, and then the exploit was done in the month of May. So typically, if you even follow the PCI DSS cycle of 90 days, if you essentially if the vulnerability gets released in the month of March, and assuming that the vulnerability management tools are able to detect it, you still have 3 months to patch it, which means that you essentially have time till June, and we still see organizations not following the 90 days, but that was good enough for Equifax to actually get exploited. So we've got the vulnerability management as one of the key learnings. And then last but not the least is the PCI risk assessment. We've seen that has been one of the teething issues. Way back in 2012, I had the opportunity to lead a special interest group from the PCI DSS Council, which documented this PCI DSS risk assessment guidance document. And it's I would encourage all organizations, if you have if you have not done this earlier, to please download that guidance document and see how you can actually implement it. It kind of helps us identify all unique risks which needs to be considered from a payment data security standpoint, and helps us prepare a proactive strategy of reducing those risks at the end of the day. So with that, I pass it on to Lohit. One of the key things that I would he would want to elaborate is on the effective security operations center, and what kind of trends and what kind of challenges that he foresees in organizations from a SOC standpoint. Over to you, Lohit.
Thanks, Darshan. So going ahead, Effective Security Operations Center is one of the key learnings from our SURF report 2018 by, as mentioned by Darshan earlier. What we believe is that there are 5 key areas: collection of data and structurization, data enrichment, threat scenarios, hunting, and incident response. As defined, this is a method of identification and search for specific incidents based on scenarios, resulting in finding indicators of compromise and attacks before actually when the data is exfiltrated. The method contains multiple steps which facilitates the objective of identification of indicators of compromise and attack. The ingress can happen from any device, thus monitoring ingress points and egress points is of dire importance and is more of a requirement today than it's being an option. In the collection of data phase, the data sources are scoped and critical crown jewels of the organizations are identified and configured to either send, or we can collect the logs using an agent as well. From at the same time, the data is also structurized, has to be structurized and enriched without altering the original source, as the original source has to be preserved for if at all there is a forensic investigation which has to happen. Adding on to that original source, the data structurization and enrichment process will help us add more information to it, like GeoIP locations, subtype, classification of log, like if we are able to tell if a log is a configuration log, if it's authorization log or authentication log, etc. So the classification also will help us in doing higher modeling of data, like collecting the data sets and seeing if there are anomalies in authentication process and authorization process. And this can be done by basic analysis of graphs. You don't have to do ML for this. For the configuration and structurization phase, now that the data is at our disposal, assuming we have a console to search for, one can devise scenarios which I can explain using a small demonstration over here. I'll just go off over here to a video. So you can see in this graph where we have spikes. So we do something called a spike analysis. So spike analysis helps us in identifying long tail as well as short tail. In doing short tail analysis, this will ensure that we're not missing some anomalies when the graph is going really high. That means in the peak hours of the day, when the graph is hitting its peak points, and in that point or period of time, if there are any anomalies which have to be identified, as well as when we are receiving the lowest amount of logs, if there are any anomalies over there, we will also be able to identify them. So in this analysis phase, what we can do is we can go to the peak point as well as the lowest point and identify the logs which are there. So you can see we can select the date and time and jump into the raw logs page where we'll be able to tell if there is any anomalies over there. So before I go ahead with this, I just want to explain a little bit about the whole threat hunting process. So what is threat hunting or intelligent monitoring? In this day and age, it's not enough that only logs are collected and alerts are reviewed on a nominal basis or a daily basis, because if you just go ahead and review alerts and alarms, you're going to get 50,000 or 60,000 alerts. So that's going to become alert fatigue for you, and you'll not be able to do proper monitoring because it's going to become cumbersome. And there is a need for threat hunting. So what's threat hunting would be the question. Threat hunting is nothing but a process of security analytics combined with network activity tracking, as well as ensuring that monitoring is done for all the logs which are being received from every device in the environment. One way of doing this is by something called a spike analysis, which I talked about, which includes analyzing long tail as well as short tail. You can see that when we get into the raw log part, so I'm just going to replay the video over here and jump here. You can see once I select the filters, what I can do is I can select something called as executables. So executable filter is nothing but in today's world, whatever we do with the computer is we are interacting with a binary or executable. So that means we are actually directly sending information and receiving information with the computer. Imagine if a port or a virtual port is open, and if an exploit hits a particular port, or even if you download an Excel or a file from internet, what happens is that it's targeting a vulnerability in the file or the executable or a binary, and it's trying to use that process's level of capability and access to resources to actually do malicious stuff. Malicious is just defined as if it's trying to take out information or use your processor to do Bitcoin mining or even encrypt your whole devices, etc. So this is where executable monitoring comes into play. So in executable monitoring, where if you're tracking every executable in a given environment, what you can essentially build something called as a filter. So which a filter would have all the whitelisted executables in a given environment. It would serve the purpose of ensuring that you know what is being executed in a given environment, and also you're aware what is required and what is not required. So before you build these kinds of filters, it is advised that you go ahead and do this on a clean environment. For example, wherein you do a 3-step process like risk assessment and ensure you identify the proper scope. Second step would be, as Darshan highlighted, second step would be you do a proper rule review and ensure the required environments or the scoped environment is protected. And the third step would be to do a credential VA. So vulnerability assessment will ensure that all the patches are installed and upgraded, and all the systems are in place and everything which they require to be secure. Suppose that is done, then you can build this filter. So this will help in actually knowing what is required and what is not required. So once you build a filter, what you can do is you can go ahead and apply a filter, and this can be done using any tool which has a console based access. So in this case, sorry about that. In this case, where you have applied the filter, you'll be able to identify the executables which are apart from your good executables. For example, in this case, FC helper 64.exe is an executable from FortiGate, which can come up in a search result, and you can just compare and contrast signatures. You can compare and contrast hash values, which is available on the internet. And this process also can be automated using many other ways. If you sign up for STIX, taxi based information and threat feed, this information gives you IPs, blacklisted domains, hash values, file names, file extensions, and you can automate this process as well using correlation as well, or even threat feed based alerts. So this will help in actually identifying executables, because as I highlighted, if you are tracking executables, you know what is going on and what is not going on in an environment. So that's a high level process of what is threat hunting and why threat hunting might be required. So I'd like to go ahead and move on to other parts of this the process. IOCs and IOAs can also be got from STIX and taxi, which I just said. Thus the above covers the threat hunting process and how scenarios can be simulated based on attack types from a log monitoring standpoint. The incident response process is the phase wherein one can devise the steps to respond to identification of IOCs and IOAs. This does not involve pulling the plug of the system which is infected or targeted, but the opposite would be to monitor and gather information. So gather information as in you want to identify which are the other systems which the infected system is talking to, and how is it talking, whether it's using encrypted channels, which ports is it using, what are the executables which are actually communicating. So if you have all this information, it'll be helpful for you to narrow down which are the infected systems and what are the infected systems trying to do. So one of the methods in today's world, we can use DNS sinkholes even before the attack has happened to in order to monitor and target these attackers. And that being said, apart from this, you can also follow regular incident response process post the monitoring, post the incident response or high level incident response is done. So hope this session was of help, and if you can take away something which is useful for you to implement, then we have reached the goal. And I would like to hand over this to Addy now. And one small poll I would like to run as would be related to, I just wanted to know if you have how in-house SOC or have you outsourced the SOC or do you have a hybrid SOC, etc. It'll be helpful for us to understand and give an in-depth into this. Addy, over to you.
Thank you, Lohit. Thank you, Darshan, for that fantastic insights on the lessons we have learned from data breaches. Thank you so much. So with that, we open the dais for the question and answers for everyone to shoot your questions. If you have any queries with respect to any a kind of breaches clarification